Okay, so you know how we all kind of just want to move on from the whole COVID thing? Like, it's over, we're good, right?
Right.
But what if I told you this virus might have had a lasting impact? Something we're only beginning to uncover, something that could change how we think about brain health forever. We're talking memory, cognitive function, potentially even increasing the risk of conditions like Alzheimer's.
You know what's so fascinating is that for so long, we were mainly focused on the respiratory effects of COVID.
Mhm.
But the more we learn, it's like we're realizing this virus is capable of impacting like multiple systems in the body, and the nervous system is no exception.
And to really dive into this, you sent over some seriously heavy research papers,
Yeah.
3 to be exact,
No.
all dealing with this potential connection between COVID and the brain.
Yes, and one of those papers, you only sent the title, is COVID-19 a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease? Which I have to say is a pretty loading question.
Yeah,
We'll definitely circle back to that one, but we'll need to rely on the other two sources for the finer details.
Okay, so title aside, let's talk about these other papers. One is a 2022 study from Nature titled SARS-CoV-2 is associated with changes in brain structure in UK Biobank. Now this one, from my notes, seems like it has some pretty groundbreaking findings.
Absolutely. The UK Biobank study is kind of a game changer in COVID research
Okay.
because of its scale and design. They had brain scans of 785 participants from before they were infected with COVID.
Wow.
Think about that, a before picture for hundreds of brains.
The eye is huge. So they weren't just looking at people who already had neurological conditions. They were able to track changes in otherwise healthy individuals.
Exactly. That's what makes this research so powerful, you know.
Yeah.
It allows researchers to isolate the impact of the virus itself on brain structure. And what they found is, well, pretty concerning.
Okay, don't hold back. Give us the headline. What did they see in those brains?
One of the most significant findings was atrophy, and that's shrinkage,
Right.
and tissue damage in areas of the brain linked to the olfactory cortex, which is responsible for our sense of smell. And this is important because those areas are also involved in memory.
Which, we're not totally surprised about the smell part, right? Because loss of smell was and is one of the more common symptoms of COVID, even in mild cases.
Right, and that's what makes these findings even more alarming. This study primarily looked at mild cases of COVID, and even then they were seeing these structural changes.
Okay. Yeah, that's where I start to get a little freaked out. If a mild case can have these effects, what does that mean for people who had more severe infections?
It's a question researchers are, urgently trying to answer. And it's one of the reasons you wanted to explore that 2023 review paper titled Unraveling the Connection Between COVID-19 and Alzheimer's Disease, a comprehensive review.
Right, so this paper is less about one specific study and more about connecting the dots between different pieces of research that are out there.
Exactly. And one of the key connections it makes is the role of inflammation in all of this.
Okay, inflammation. That word seems to be everywhere these days when it comes to health.
It's a crucial concept to understand when we're talking about how COVID might be impacting the brain. So think of it this way. When your body is fighting an infection, it releases these molecules called cytokines, which are like little alarm bells, that trigger inflammation as part of your immune response. Now, in a normal, healthy immune response, this inflammation is temporary and it helps to clear the infection. But in some cases with COVID, we see this inflammation go into overdrive.
It's like the immune system gets stuck on high alert, right?
Yeah.
And instead of being helpful, this out-of-control inflammation actually starts to cause damage.
Precisely. And that damage isn't limited to just one part of the body. It can impact various organs, including the brain. Both the UK Biobank study and the review paper highlighted elevated levels of specific cytokines in people who had COVID. And here's where it gets interesting. Some of these same cytokines have been linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Hold on, wait, back up a second. It's not just that COVID is causing brain inflammation, it's causing the kind of inflammation that we see in Alzheimer's patients.
That's what the research suggests, yes.
Yeah.
And the review paper goes even deeper, exploring the potential mechanisms at play here. One thing they discuss is the role of ACE2 receptors.
ACE2 receptors. Those sound familiar for some reason.
They should. Remember how we talked about the virus needing a way to enter our cells? Well, ACE2 receptors are like those entry points, those doorways that the SARS-CoV-2 virus uses. And it turns out these receptors are highly concentrated in areas of the brain that are particularly vulnerable in Alzheimer's disease, like the hippocampus, which is essential for memory.
Okay, so these ACE2 receptors, which are concentrated in areas of the brain important for memory, also happen to be the same entry points COVID uses to get into our cells. That can't be good.
It's not. Think of it like this. These receptors, abundant in memory areas, are like unlocked doors for the virus. This could explain the damage seen in those regions in the UK biobank study.
This is already a lot to process, but I feel like there's even more to this COVID and Alzheimer's link, right?
You're right, there is. The review paper also points to possible genetic links, specifically mentioning the APOE4 genotype.
Okay, you're gonna have to, break that one down for me. Genotypes, alleles. That's where I need an explain it like I'm five moment.
Think of it like this. Our genes are like blueprints. They determine our susceptibility to certain diseases. Now, the APOE gene comes in different versions, kind of like different versions of a recipe. Some versions might make you more susceptible to certain ingredients, like COVID in this case. The APOE-UNC4 version is associated with a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's.
So some people are unfortunately genetically predisposed to Alzheimer's, and that's completely separate from COVID.
You got it. But here's where that connection to COVID gets really concerning. Studies have shown that people with this APOE4 genotype might be more susceptible to severe COVID.
So not only are they more likely to have issues with their memory later in life, but they're also more likely to get really sick if they catch COVID.
And to make matters worse, they also seem to have an increased risk of long-term neurological problems after COVID, including those cognitive problems we've been talking about.
So if you have this APOE4 genotype, it's like getting hit from all sides. You're more likely to get really sick from COVID, and you're more likely to have lasting brain impacts as a result of the infection.
It's definitely concerning, and it really highlights the importance of understanding these risk factors, both viral and genetic, so we can hopefully develop more targeted interventions and prevention strategies, down the line.
Right, yeah. It makes you wonder if there are other things like lifestyle changes that might mitigate some of these risks.
That's an excellent question, and we'll definitely come back to that. But first, let's shift gears for a moment. So far, we've been talking about the acute phase of COVID, the time when you're actually sick with the virus. But this long COVID phenomenon, that seems to be a whole other beast, doesn't it? What are these sources saying about the long-term impacts on the brain?
Yeah, that was something I was really curious about when I sent over these articles. What happens after the initial infection is gone?
The review paper really digs into this. It talks about how even after that initial infection clears, the virus might leave a mark on brain health through a couple of different ways. One, we've already touched on those lingering effects of the cytokine storm, that intense immune overreaction.
So even after things calm down, the damage is already done, and it can keep impacting the brain.
It's like the initial damage is just the first domino to fall. And unfortunately, the review paper highlights another concern, the possibility of direct brain invasion by the virus. There's growing evidence that SARS-CoV-2 can actually cross the blood-brain barrier, which is supposed to be like a security system, protecting the brain from harmful substances in the bloodstream.
Wait, so the virus has a way to bypass our defenses and get directly into the brain? And if that's the case, it opens up a whole other level of potential problems.
That's right. And one of the main entry points they're seeing is, you guessed it, the olfactory bulb, that smell center we talked about earlier.
So that loss of smell that many people experience with COVID, that could be a sign that the virus has actually invaded the brain.
Okay, this is getting a little scary. It's definitely unsettling. And while we don't want to alarm anyone, I do think it's important to acknowledge that the research we've explored today suggests that COVID-19 could have significant and potentially long-lasting impacts on brain health.
It makes you think twice about just brushing off even a mild case of COVID. So where does this all leave us? What can we do with this information?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? More research is definitely needed, especially on the long-term effects of COVID on the brain and that potential link to Alzheimer's disease.
I mean, seriously, we've covered so much ground, from how even those mild cases of COVID can cause changes in the brain to the role of inflammation and genetics. And then there's that unsettling idea of the virus potentially getting into the brain directly.
And it's that last part, the possibility of direct brain invasion, that raises a rather intriguing question, one that wasn't really directly addressed in the research you sent over, but is definitely worth pondering.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What are you thinking?
Well, if this virus, if SARS-CoV-2 can bypass the blood-brain barrier and infect brain cells, what does that mean for other viruses? Could this be a mechanism at play in other neurological conditions or even neurodegenerative diseases beyond Alzheimer's?
Wow, that's a pretty profound thought. So you're saying that all this research on COVID and the brain might have implications for how we understand brain health in a much broader sense.
Exactly. It's like COVID has given us this new lens through which to view this, like, very complex relationship between viruses, the immune system, and the brain. And while the immediate focus is, of course, on COVID, the discoveries being made today, could really pave the way for breakthroughs in other areas of neurological research.
That's actually a really hopeful thought to end on, because let's be honest, this deep dive has been, well, pretty heavy. But it's also sparked some really important questions and could ultimately lead to a better understanding of how to protect our most valuable asset, or our brains. Not just from COVID, but potentially from, other threats as well.
I think that's a great takeaway. This is a field that's rapidly evolving. And while there's still so much we don't know, the research we've discussed today highlights just how vital it is that we continue to investigate and be proactive when it comes to our brain health.
Well said. And to our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has been informative and eye-opening, maybe even a little inspiring to really dig deeper into this fascinating and crucial area of research. We'll certainly be keeping a close eye on it, and we encourage you to do the same. Okay.